introduction, Ariel, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. I just want to start out by saying, and I hope my two co-conspirators will join me in saying, happy birthday, Walt Whitman, 200. So before we each get into our respective sections, I thought it would be fun to just talk about some of the absolute basics about Pfaffs. P-F-A-F-F''S. So what, Ed, was Pfaffs? In a very concise statement, what was it?
Yeah, so there was a German immigrant named Charles Pfaff who came here in the aftermath of some of the revolutions in Europe in 1848. Started this restaurant bar that quickly became a meeting place for writers and artists. And he had great food, European magazines and newspapers, and he gave a very generous line of credit to the writers and artists.
Alright, so Karen, how does Walt Whitman fit into all of this?
Basically, Pfaff really gets going around the time that Whitman is interested, right? He's looking for community, and he is pretty much a loner for most of his life. But there was something about Pfaff that attracted him, and Ed knows this too, that Pfaffs served. For those of you that are new, we were just in the space at Pfaff's store. So we were communing with the spirit of Pfaff's in that space. It's underneath Commons Deli now, so we were just standing on this sparkling water and chopping broccoli and stuff, and really trying to suss up that space. And I think for Whitman, there was a combination. First of all, Pfaff was serving lager beer, which was really new to New York at this time. They had had stout and ale and sort of British types of drinks, and then when the Germans started flocking over after the revolutions of the late 1840s, they introduced this new beer, which Whitman apparently really enjoyed, but he also really enjoyed the company at Pfaff's. And Ed Whitley's site, which I urge you, if you're interested in Bohemia, that website is a great catalog of the Bohemians that frequented Pfaff's. Men, women, writers, artists, fascinating underground history of subterranean New York. And Whitman, I guess, had found his place, you know, like somewhere where the outsider was welcomed in. But you know a lot about the space, Brad, so, you know, as a preservationist, because you were down there with us just now, can you tell us a little bit? I know we've tried to landmark that space with very little success, but maybe you could introduce something about that space.
So the Walt Whitman Initiative is a nonprofit that's really been trying on multiple fronts to find ways to commemorate Whitman's presence in New York City on his 200th birthday. So we've been working on things like the Ryerson House landmarking in Brooklyn, the last remaining residence of over 30 places that Whitman lived in both Brooklyn and in Manhattan. They are all demolished, except for the one last house on Ryerson between Pratt's campus and the Navy Yard. Funny, Walt Whitman living near the Navy Yard. I have no idea why that might have been the case. But along with that site, we actually have some positive news in that Council Member Lori Cumbo, who's the Council Majority Leader, just let us know that she plans to support co-naming that block of Ryerson as Walt Whitman Way. But we still need support letters from community organizations. So if you are from a group that's in a position to give a letter, please get right on that. We would love to have your support as well to make sure that goes through.
We have a dedicated site at the Whitman Initiative for, you know, stuff about how people can help. So there's a change.org petition where we have about 6,000 signatures now. We're very close to that. The more signatures we have, the better for that. And also we've been writing to, you know, the governor and so forth, just trying to get their attention on this issue.
Right. We're also looking to put up a monument at the site in Brooklyn Heights where Whitman actually helped to set the type at the Rome Brothers print shop to actually print that first edition of Leaves of Grass in 1855. That building used to be at the corner of Cranberry and Fulton, which is now Academy Plaza West. That was demolished in the early 60s, and I'm going to get into that a bit more later when I put on my New York Preservation Archive hat and tell you about the history of that preservation effort and why it should inform our efforts today. And really, in my mind, give us a kick in the pants and say, get out there and do something, because if you don't, you will lose these sites that mean something to us and to the world's sense of literature. But Pfaffs itself, now Ed, I would say you are the foremost expert here on Pfaffs. Would you say Pfaffs or Pfaffs before I go any further?
I say both.
That's no help.
Yeah, normally I say Pfaffs, but I don't speak German.
I always say Pfaffs, but I'm a German speaker.
Sure.
Okay. Well, we'll go with the German
You
speaker.
all have to decide.
Well, I'll phone a friend and keep using Pfaffs for the evening. With respect to this particular site, or I should say next door, because we're talking about 647 Broadway. And I think you'll get into this later, but Pfaffs was not always located at that spot. Charlie Pfaff moved the bar and the restaurant up and down Broadway numerous times, but when Whitman really came to interface with it, it was at 647.
Before the Civil War, that was the spot that
Right.
everybody would go to, yeah.
Right. So we did work with Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, now Village Preservation, on trying to find a way to get, at the very least, a plaque on that building. And now we're really thinking in the sidewalk itself, because as you'll find out tonight, the vault at Pfaff's that everyone talks about was actually the space sort of tucked under the sidewalk. And then it has barrel vaulting above, but there are sort of two conjoined spaces that are set off.
I know that part of this structure also has it maybe further out.
Right.
But those of us that were just standing underneath there saw the vaulting, which probably was all red brick when it was original. Right now it's been repaired, so you have like concrete up there, and then you have to imagine gas lamps and the bohemian crowd hanging around this big high table, right? And
Can we read a little from the poem?
Yes.
Yeah.
This will give you a sense of what the Pfaff space was all about.
So Whitman had a notebook that he kept during his time. He jotted notes about places that he would visit, men that he was interested in, notes of poems. There are even illustrations of it from some of the artists that were at Pfaff. So clearly they grabbed his book and sometimes draw not so flattering pictures of Walt, sometimes with a red nose to show that he was drunk. But Whitman wrote probably about half of a poem that he never published, and I'll read some of it. It says, "The vaulted Pfaffs where the drinkers and laughers meet to eat and drink and carouse, while on the walk immediately overhead past the myriad feet of Broadway," and that's the sidewalk. You could hear them walking. "As the dead in their graves are underfoot hidden, and the living pass over them, wrecking on. Laugh on, laughers, drink on, drinkers, bandy the jest, toss the field from one to another, beam up, brighten up, bright eyes, beautiful young men."
I guess for me, what's really important about that space is it was a permissive space. So Whitman met a lot of people there that he was attracted to. It's hard to say who Whitman's first love interest was, but a lot of us think it was a streetcar driver named Fred Vaughn. And he presumably met Fred in that space at Pfaff's right next door here. There is, I've co-curated an exhibition called Poet of the Body, New York's Walt Whitman, which is at the Grillier Club right now, where we have a letter from Fred Vaughn to Whitman, where Fred admits that he's getting married. And I put that in the exhibition because I thought, wow, what a crazy moment in time, right? To have a lover and to be connected, and then at one point, one of them gives up for sort of a heteronormative existence and kind of leaves Walt out to dry. But I'm guessing all sorts of, emotional, gut-wrenching things happened in the space at Pfaff as Whitman is really discovering his identity. And as I tell my students, and what's interesting about it is the word homosexual hasn't been coined yet. So there's no, arguably there's no community, there's no sticking hold to a group. So Whitman, in, for instance, the poems that I kind of distributed to you, like some of you have them, he really wrestled with ideas of identity and self at this time. So a lot of that happened when he was writing books.
Yeah, and in the letter you referenced, it's in the Grillier exhibit, it's actually, you know, as a gay man, it was very painful to see because Fred Vaughn says it underlines significantly, Walt, I want you to be there, or something to that effect. It's very clear that there's this ongoing attachment and yet destiny, so to speak, is sort of pulling them apart. So yeah, it's worth seeing.
Karen's just edited a beautiful volume of the poems that Walt most likely wrote as the relationship with Fred Vaughn, and the book's called Live Oak with Moss.
Actually have it.
Oh, please show it. Yeah, it's the first time that these poems have stood on their own in an edition. Karen edited it with illustrations, more like illuminations, from the artist Brian Selznick, am I pronouncing his name right?
Yeah. He's known as a children's book illustrator, so he's done The Invention of Hugo Cabret. Maybe some of your kids have read it, but the whole idea is to bring complex literary content to the general public. And first, Brian has, you know, just a series of illustrations that kind of tie in with the poems themselves, and then the poems come. So, and it's erotic too, because the poems are quite erotic. And then an afterward actually, so you can dig deeper into it. I'm happy to pass it out if you'd like to take it. Those poems are actually reproduced on the sheet that you have. So do you guys mind if you do another?
For it.
These 12 poems, these Live Oak with Moss poems that you have the handout for, were never published by Walt Whitman. That's why they're so precious. He obviously really was trying to come to terms with his own sexual identity and didn't think it was time to release them, so he cut them up and he rearranged them, he edited them. Some of it wound up in a collection called Calamus that you might know, that wound up in Leaves of Grass, the third edition of Leaves of Grass in 1860. But there's one in particular, one poem that I find incredibly moving. So, and we didn't read it on the tour, guys. I know some of you are like, wait, we read some poems on the tour. If you flip in your handout, if you have one, and share it with your neighbor, please, to poem number Roman numeral 8. And the handout also has images of Whitman through time, so you can kind of see the age as you go through these 12 poems. This one is always the one that is my favorite, and I feel so many of my own students have been so strongly affected by this poem. I'm going to let it speak for itself. Okay. Hours continuing long, sore and heavy-hearted. Hours of the dusk, when I withdraw to a lonesome and unfrequented spot, seating myself, leaning my face in my hands. Hours sleepless deep in the night, when I go forth speeding swiftly the country roads, or through the city streets, or pacing miles and miles, stifling plaintive cries. Hours discouraged, distracted. For he, the one I cannot content myself without. Soon I saw him content himself without me. Hours when I am forgotten, or weeks and months are passing, but I believe I am never to forget. Sullen and suffering hours, I am ashamed, but it is useless. I am what I am. Hours of my torment. I wonder if other men ever have the like, out of the like feelings. Is there even one other like me, distracted, his friend, his lover lost to him? Is he too as I am now? Does he still rise in the morning dejected, thinking who is lost to him? And at night, awaking, think who is lost? Does he too harbor his friendship silent and endless, harbor his anguish and passion? As some stray reminder or the casual mention of a name, bring the fit back upon him, taciturn and depressed. Does he see himself reflected in these hours? Does he see the face of his hours reflected? I always have a hard time. But this is, well, it sounds like a sonnet, right? We tend to think of Whitman's poems as longer, but these Live Oak with Moss poems are very tight and contained. And this is actually a 12-line poem, coming very close to the idea of a sonnet. I have a theory that he left out the couplet at the end, you know, sonnets being 14 lines most of the time. He left out the couplet to signify the missing couple somehow. And also, you know, the last couplet of a sonnet, the two rhyming lines at the end tend to resolve the sonnet. There's no resolution to this, right? This is about a man who's been in love and has lost and is looking desperately for a connection. And actually projecting into the future, I think that's why it's so effective. The first half of the poem has hours repeated a lot, and of course when you pronounce that, it's O-U-R-S, which is also a reminder of the missing, you know, the couple that once was, that's now gone. And going back to your high school days, you might remember that a sonnet usually has a volta, like a turning point where, you know, the mood shifts. And if you look at this one, it changes kind of when he stops repeating hours, right? Sullen and suffering hours. I am ashamed, but it is useless. I am what I am. I mean, who could read that and not be affected, right? Whitman is basically coming out right there without the word, you know, without a word for it, but a kind of a recognition of self that sounds resigned, but at the same time I feel like it's so brave, and it has helped so many of my students. This one, I just find it very meaningful. And I have to think that this may well have been written, or at least inspired by the place a few hundred feet from us right here. This place where he finally found the company of men that he loved and lost, and produced these incredibly beautiful
Can you talk about Intimate, the Fred Gray?
Yeah.
So if you don't remember anything else, the two Freds, first Fred Vaughn, the stagecoach driver who was many of us were his first love of his life. And then when he was here at Pfaff, there was a group of younger men who were medical students or involved in their education at some point. And they centered around a young man named Frederick Schiller Gray. We have in some of Whitman's notes that he referred to him as the Fred Gray Association. And they were mostly middle class, they were well educated. Whitman was about 40 at this time, and these young men would have been in their early 20s. And among all the different people that gathered at Pfaff, they were kind of his crowd, his most intimate group. At some level they were fans, at another level they were dear and intimate friends. We know that when Whitman left to Washington, D.C., he kept in touch with them, and he would write letters to the whole group saying, "My darlings and gossips." And the letters are more playful and intimate than really any of the other letters that Whitman sent. There's something special about it. There's Fred Gray himself volunteered to serve in the Union Army, and we know that Whitman was very moved by his service, very worried about him. He got to know Fred's parents, and would go and he was at the Gray home when Fred was being sent out. Fred came back with his tales of seeing the front. And as we were talking with Brad just a little bit earlier, this may have been the time when Whitman really starts thinking about his Civil War poems. You know, before he's down there firsthand in Washington, D.C., meeting with wounded soldiers, it might be Fred Gray's stories. And Fred gives him a volume of prose writers of Germany. And that copy's at Swarthmore Library. We have it.
It's actually in the exhibit.
Oh, do you have it? Oh, Karen brought it up to New York, where it belongs.
If you go to the earlier,
Yeah.
it's on.
Good.
It's on exhibition.
Don't let him have it back. It belongs here. But that shows that, and we know that German Romanticism had a huge impact on Whitman early on. We know he was still writing about Hegel and others late in life. So the conversations he was having with Fred Gray and this group were very serious. They weren't just fanboys gushing over this poem. They were having serious intellectual conversations. Just to think of first Fred Vaughn and then Fred Gray and these poems that come out, one of the meaningful poems.
So Whitman is here again, remember, about 1859 to 1862, right up to sort of the beginnings of the Civil War. And the standard narrative is that Whitman goes down to Virginia to the front to find his brother George and leaves him there. That's the standard narrative. After chatting with Ed quite a bit on this, I start to wonder, given just how intimate this relationship was with Fred Gray, whether that wasn't actually possible even impetus for Whitman to go south. And then, as you may know, he does move then to Washington, D.C., and then goes into that period where he's visiting the wounded soldiers, including several soldiers and men who are now buried out at Greenwood Cemetery. So if you get out to Greenwood, ask the staff, and they do have the records of which men. Whitman, for example, would write letters home for these injured men. Some of them are actually out there at Greenwood.
And the scholar Stephanie Blaylock at the University of Iowa, she's found that among some of the men in these hospitals, Whitman would try to recreate the environment in Pfaff. There's some European newspapers, have some good strong coffee, have some conversations. So not only was he writing these letters back to the bohemians that he left behind, he was trying to capture that feeling again.
So, before we get into a little bit of a deeper dive into the actual personalities around this giant 30-person table, so really we are sort of recreating that feeling. But you have to imagine about 30 people around this big table, lots of smoke, the barrel vaults overhead, the pounding from the omnibuses and the wagons out on the street, the thousands of people walking overhead.
And don't forget that there's the Broadway, there's like very
heavy Germanic food.
Fun cooking. Because also in the exhibit we have a menu from
That's
us,
right.
so you can see like it was typical German fare, and the thing that strikes me, especially if you're going into the basement, is how smoky and dark it must have been. You know, like a typical subterranean way to descend into this nether region.
Right. So before we descend, how did Whitman himself actually get to Pfaff? Because in 1859, he's going there every night, from what the accounts seem to say. So you remember, he lived in Brooklyn at this point, so he's making about a 6.5 miles journey. And, you know, he has to take a certain contrivance over the East River. There's this obscure poem that you've probably never, ever heard of. I don't know if anyone, maybe there's one expert in the room who's heard of this poem. Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Yes. So he would take the ferry, and that of course figures prominently in the of course. And then, as Ed was mentioning, the stagecoach drivers, you see in his notebooks and you see in his poetry all these references constantly to these omnibus drivers. So an omnibus was sort of a big, heavy stagecoach wagon that's going up and down Broadway, and really Whitman seemed to love riding with the drivers. He sort of saw them as a sort of special breed, a part of sort of the rough and sort of the genuine in the city.
He had a type, right? Because Pete Doyle, the love of his life that he met in Washington, was also a stagecoach driver. And they all seemed to be Irish, like really Irish born. So he liked that. And also they were all like 20, 22 years younger than he. So definitely had like a flavor.
I think with Pete Doyle in particular, Doyle had been a Confederate soldier, a Southerner, and Whitman in his poetry talks about reconciling opposites and bringing people together. So I imagine there's Walt, proud of his British heritage, proud to be a Northerner, proud to be supporting the Union Army, madly in love with an Irish Southerner who fought for the Confederate. That loving embrace was not just a personal relationship, it was very much that, but it was also, look at what the rest of us do. Look at this example.
And the Calamus poems that Karen was talking about earlier and read from, you know, everyone reads them and says immediately, oh, this is clearly signifying some sort of homoerotic connection. But as Karen has made very clear to me, it's about way more than that. It's also about this effort on Walt's part to stitch a fraying country back together through these intimate personal connections. Because again, this is happening right, he publishes the Calamus poems in 1860. What's happening right after that? The Civil War. So he can, you know, it's almost as if he can feel this fraying happening. And the poems are doing double duty. They are not just about homoerotic attraction. They're about unifying the country through these personal relationships.
And I really like how Whitman, I mean, one of the reasons we love him is because he actually practices what he preaches. He goes down to the Civil War front. So before that, he's trying to stitch the country together by writing these poems. But during the Civil War, he's actually sewing people, he's suturing wounds and writing letters to soldiers. So that to me is such a difference with so many of the other writers around during the Civil War.
So let's talk about some of those other writers, some of those other figures at Pfaff's. As you arrive out here on the pavements of Broadway, the blab of the pavements that he mentions, with everybody going by. But as you descend down into the dark and the gloom, and that's very fitting because Ed was the mascot of all the bohemians around this big table.
Mascot or ringleader?
Well, either or.
That would have been a man named Henry Pfaff Jr. He was originally from Boston, and he was an abolitionist and a temperance advocate. So he was preaching that we should do alcohol and coffee and just stay with cold water. But then he goes to Paris in the 1840s, and he changes his mind about that. And he sees bohemianism firsthand in the Latin Quarter. He's seeing the people that will become part of the story that Henry Murger writes in the Bohemians of the Latin Quarter, published in the 1840s in French, 1850s in English, is the foundation for Puccini's La Bohème, that gives rise to the Bohemian Vogue in the 1890s, which has been the foundation of Rent, the Broadway musical in the 90s. So Henry Pfaff sees this firsthand, that when I get back to New York, we're doing this. And so there's this perfect alignment of the planets with Pfaff setting up this bar here, Clapp saying this is where we're going to do it, people like Whitman coming and joining in. And Clapp and Whitman would have been a similar age. They would have been in their early 40s. Clapp was referred to as the oldest man, which I am now older than he was. When I feel very self-conscious, but he was very much the ringleader. He was the editor of a literary weekly called the Saturday Press, which again, a weekly that came out with poetry, short stories, book reviews, theater reviews. There was even a chess column. And Whitman first publishes Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking in the Saturday Press. And that's his great Ars Poetica, his poem about becoming a poet and realizing that would be his calling and his life mission. And Henry Clapp really throws all of his support behind Whitman. He says to the other bohemians, come on guys, whatever you're going to write it about Whitman, whether it's a parody or an appreciation or an homage, or he gets mentioned even in the drama columns, the theater criticism. Whitman shows up in there for no reason other than that Henry Clapp was saying it's all Whitman all the time. And this comes at the perfect time for Whitman's career. The first two editions of Leaves of Grass didn't do well commercially. Some of them did okay critically. Gets his heart broken by the relationship with Fred Vaughn. He's back at home. He's really working hard as a journalist. And here he's got this community and a really strong advocate. And it catches the attention of a publisher in Boston. And this is the first major publishing house. And they pick up Leaves of Grass. They say we're going to publish it in 1860. They like the Saturday Press so much that they say we want to buy that. Henry Clapp, you stay on as the editor, but we want to be associated with this. Fortunately, the 1860 Leaves of Grass comes out, does really well. Unfortunately, the Civil War comes and the finances of this publisher, they publish a lot of abolitionist writings as well. They're not able to buy out the Saturday Press. It goes under. Flash forward just for about 10 years.
I wanted to
Please
say a
jump in.
word on the women.
Yes, please do. Yes.
Because at this time in New York, eating and socializing was really segregated. Like maybe some of you have seen, even in high schools from the 20th century, an entry for boys and entry for girls. Waiting rooms were divided by sex. So what was really great about Pfaff's is that everybody went, everybody was invited. It was in the spirit of the German beer cellars that are, that you see in Europe, that it's almost a family thing. So there were very radical women that were included in the circle, and that did a lot for Whitman's career. Like Ada Isaacs Menken, who was a very prominent actress at the time, spoken with reviews of Leaves of Grass. I mentioned on the tour, I love her flesh tone bodysuit that she wore on stage, so she would look naked and she rode like a live horse, climbing a mountain on stage. I mean, we're talking about, it's so colorful, the group that Whitman got to hang with. Ada Clare was another very provocative actress who had illegitimate children that she would bring with her to Pfaff's. So truly, I almost should have had my daughter here. It's like in the spirit of thinking about that kind of mix. And to Whitman's credit, he recognizes women in Leaves of Grass in a way that you do not see any other 19th century writer really speak out. One of my favorite stories is women's pants were invented in the early 1850s, right around the time that the suffragette movement is beginning, the women's rights activism is getting started in the early 1850s. There's an activist named Amelia Bloom who invents bloomers. And they are, I mean, probably some of you have images of gym shorts, right, that are a little too puffy. But back then they were kind of split skirts, pretty much. Well, they led to women being able to do all sorts of things that they had not been able to do, right, with just wearing a skirt.
And what do some of the visitors, the transcendentalists who come down to visit Walt, what do they say about him and his appearance and garb?
So when Bronson Alcott, who is Louisa May Alcott's father, who was a big thinker himself, he and Thoreau went to visit Whitman in 1856 to see who this crazy poet was. And they went to a place called Brooklyn. What was that? Brooklyn is on the map as literary Brooklyn because Whitman is the grandfather of literary Brooklyn, right? Before that, Brooklyn was just like another, community, fast growing. But they went to visit him, and Bronson Alcott does a double take at Whitman's outfit, and he says, he's wearing man bloomers. So if you really think about that, I mean, Walt just crossed he was, try to wrap your head around that, he's wearing women's. I think that's great.
Yeah, this whole crew around the table at Pfaff's is just so interesting. There's a guy also named Fitzhugh Ludlow, and he was only about 21 at the time that Whitman was coming here, so he's much younger, this younger set of bohemians. But he had written the book The Hashish Eaters, which was this whole recounting of his experiences with drugs, and then he becomes an opiate addict, goes off to travel to the American West with Frederick Bierstadt, a great landscape artist. But it's just this very, very interesting crew of people. Ada Clare, you were mentioning the illegitimate baby, that was with Louis Moreau Gottschalk, as far as we can tell, up from New Orleans, who was also buried out at Greenwood Cemetery. But it's just this really interesting mix of people who are thinking outside the box and very good acting out their lives outside the box.
And there are relationships among the women as well, deep friendships, intimate sexual relationships as well. Ada Isaacs Mencken, who Karen mentioned earlier, she published a poem in one of the local New York papers called A Reply to Dora Shaw. Dora Shaw was another actress and poet in this circuit. It's a really curious poem. I don't know what she's applying to. If you go back in the newspaper, there's not like, okay, Dora's writing this one to Ada. That's what it is. But she's professing loyalty, love, and there's a really key word that she uses in the poem. Ada Mencken was, she was always changing her identity, claiming sometimes that she was African American, sometimes she was Spanish, that she was Jewish. She was always kind of ambiguous about it. And then this was very much a part of her public persona. This was one of the things she traded on as an actress and a writer. And in this poem to Dora Shaw, she says, I pledge again in women's truth, I am no changeling, doubt me not. So the rest of the world may say, who is Ada Mencken? She's a different person from week to week, but to you, Dora Shaw, don't change. Relationships. Ada Clare and Getty Gay. Getty Gay was one of the women in Pfaff. She worked for the Saturday Press. Just very recently, Walt Whitman, whom I worked with at Lehigh University on the Vault of Pfaff, he was combing through this 22-volume diary by a British writer named Thomas Butler Gunn, who kind of circled around the Pfaff crowd. And he says, there are whispers of a sapphic relationship of the Parisian variety between Ada Clare and Getty Gay. So it wasn't just Whitman and the Fred Gray Association. This was part of it.
Wasn't there also a letter that Whitman received from a certain Ellen? Yes. What was that all about?
That Ellen Eyre, according to Ted Janaway's tape, was actually a man dressing up and blackmailing he would pretend to be a prostitute, I guess dressed as a woman, and then he would reveal himself yourself and then say, like, pay up or I'm going to tell your wife. And, but Whitman writes a really provocative letter to him. So I'm unclear on whether Whitman had a relationship with him.
Well, this, Ted Genoese is just 3 pages of this book. It's this bombshell that drops in the middle of this book about Whitman's life between 1868 and 1862. And the interesting part is the Ellen Eyre letter. For years, scholars would say, all right, Whitman isn't gay, he's at very least bisexual, probably straight, because we know this woman, Ellen Eyre, she's writing to him at Pfaff, she knows he's there. And so a lot of biographers and scholars would just grab onto this for years and years, but again, Genoese reveals that it's William Kinney, and Whitman's response is really interesting, because he's like, basically, and we also know from his notes that Whitman says, as he would talk to different men, he said, I told him the whole story of Ellen Eyre. So Genoese speculates that this was, Whitman was kind of feeling some of these men out. Of like, so there's this guy who's just like a woman, and he wanted to have a relationship with me. What do you think of that?
I am glad you brought up this effort to heterosexualize women, because this is something that came up on the tour. The tour we just did started at Stonewall and ended at Pfaff. I was trying to connect, because as we talked about, gay bars have been a haven for gay people before there were centers and support systems. And Whitman himself, his career, has had a history of academics and others trying to make him straight, right? Like almost through the 20th century, there was even a book out, Free and Lonesome Heart, I guess that's called. And this was a legitimate Whitman scholar that wrote an entire book about Whitman's actual son living somewhere down south. Because Whitman, to avoid a tricky question at the end of his life, says offhandedly, oh, I've got grandchildren all over the place. So one of these scholars, named Emery Holloway, runs with that and actually writes an entire study about Whitman being heterosexual and having progeny down south. So that's a really interesting thing about Whitman, because now he stands out as the great gay icon, right? And I mean, my students are actually writing papers on gender fluidity of Whitman, because at least in the poetry, he's sort of floating amidst everything. There's polyamory, there's masturbation, there's no topic left unturned by Whitman. But despite that, there's been a history of people trying to slot him and see him as a heterosexual.
When my students ask me, is Whitman gay? I'll say, okay, well, the short answer is yes. The long answer is also yes. The academic answer is, what we mean by sexual identity is fairly relatively recent idea, late 19th, early 20th century. So what Karen is saying about her students understanding and exploring Whitman is experimenting with a variety of gendered identities and sexual experiences. That's very common for pre-20th century sexual identities. And we have a touch point with this, again at Pfaff, with the Irish writer Fitzjames O'Brien, who wrote a parody poem of Whitman calling him a counter-jumper, which was...
Yeah, does anyone know what that is? The counter-jumper. It's a really interesting term.
What, do you want to explain?
No.
So it was a term that was used for men who worked as clerks and at dry goods stores, so like at shopping malls or other general goods stores, and these men were seen as more effeminate, as weak. There are some great illustrations in Vanity Fair of a man in like a full ball gown with this huge beard, and this was the counter jumper, someone who's not quite male, not quite female. And O'Brien writes this parody in Whitman's style, and he really understands Whitman, because he nails the style, and he calls him a counter jumper. And that was published very publicly in Vanity Fair. More privately, O'Brien wrote a poem that was just circulated here at Pfaff, so printed it on a broadside, and just the people read it here. And in describing Whitman, he said that Whitman, he don't want to put a green shade on the sun, meaning it's a bright light of nature, the bright light of the sun. Whitman's not the kind of person who want to cover it up, just let that light shine. And then he rhymes that with, or try to make two look as if they were one. He's saying, when the rest of the guys would go down to the brothels, Whitman never wanted to join us. Now we don't know, did O'Brien know that Whitman was gay? Did he know what was going on with the Fred Gray Association? Or was he aware there's a way that this guy is expressing his identity, expressing his gender, expressing his relationship that is outside of a developing, if that makes sense. So again, short answer, yes, he was gay. Long answer, the academic answer, sexuality in the 19th century is really interesting.
Yes. One other topic I want to touch on before we open it up for some questions is who's hovering overhead in these vaulted ceilings at Pfaff's. This sort of thematic. So Henry Clapp was the king of Bohemia, and he was the ringleader. But who was the mascot? Who was sort of the inspiration for the Bohemians? And I'm thinking of.
It's your guy.
Yeah. Like a raven,
Edgar
like a raven
Allan
overhead.
Sorry about that. I told myself I wouldn't bring it up because I've been talking to. Yeah, that's right. The Bohemians loved Edgar Allan Poe. He was a Bohemian before there was Bohemianism. He was committed to his art. That he was willing to die for it. Willing to live through poverty. That he was willing to go to battle for it, either in salons or in the press. He wrote this long series called The Literati of New York, that people might have heard of or read before, which is just gossip and finger pointing at every other writer in New York City. So a lot of the Pfaff's Bohemians really latch on to Poe. There's something about him, and not just in his personality, but his aesthetic as well. A kind of dark humor that really latches on. The first couple short stories that are published in Saturday Press are by a British writer named William North that Henry Clapp had met in London. North had come to the U.S. He didn't make it as a writer. He tried, he struggled, he committed suicide, and he left an envelope with like 11 cents that he said, "Here, I'm leaving my fortune as a writer." And so there was Edgar Allan Poe, and he had a bunch of literary surrogates among the Pfaffians that when Whitman walks into this world, he's walking in many ways into Poe's world. Thomas Bailey Aldrich said, "We were prowling the streets while we were still resting in the shadow of Poe." And there are no.
Do you know about Poe's house here on Pfaff?
That's right. Yeah. So, when he said the shadow of Poe, it's literal, right? I mean, and the offices of Broadway Journal. Please tell us.
The effort to save that house in the early 2000s, I know this is an NYU faculty member, unfortunately, but Poe had written The Gold Bug there and a couple of other stories, right? The Cask of Witness, I think. And NYU was determined to build the law school, and there was a big battle, and because President Sexton at that time. And the result is, sadly, they did knock down the building. They put up, if you walk behind NYU Law School, the facade of the building is put up kind of Disneyland style on that side.
Not with the actual bricks.
Not with the actual bricks. And every Thursday from 9 to 11 a.m., I think, you can go into the courtroom where they have like the banister and a couple of other pieces.
Plus the palace.
But this is another story about historic preservation, that from this area, right, even the Merchants House Museum is in trouble, right? So all of these precious things, the building here too.
Yeah, and that's actually a great time. One thing I did want to mention before we get into questions, and that's look at the example of the Rome Brothers print shop. This was again at what was Cranberry and Fulton, which is now in Canton Plaza, right in the High Street subway stop in Brooklyn Heights. And in the early 60s, this was threatened, even though it had a big plaque, the Finta plaque on it, that was by a Hungarian artist. It was on the side of that building, and it was very well known. If you look through the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in the 30s, there's a big resurgence of interest in Whitman at that site. And again, in the 50s, there's a big push. But what happens? Urban renewal. And so you have Moses and others pushing urban renewal. And that area is slated to be given some urban renewal. And so there's multiple groups form. And of course, you know, in Brooklyn Heights at this time, there's this great push by people like Otis Pratt-Pearsall and some of the others who are really fighting to get historic history before there's even a landmarks law.
And there are poets like Allen Ginsberg and Marion Moore that tried to get together and save that building.
Yes.
It's just too late.
Yeah, so it was Marianne Moore, Robert Frost, Carl Sandburg, Arthur Miller, you name it. A whole cavalcade of prominent artists came out in favor of keeping the building. I was looking through some documents today, and they even came up with a plan for a Whitman museum there that would have actually held artifacts, and they wanted to actually tie it in with UNESCO to make it sort of this world peace center in a way, or sort of international relations center, all
Something
surrounded
we
by
talked
Whitman.
about with the 99 Writers Center.
Right.
We'd love to make it into a poetry center for the community. You know, something, have a writer in residence live where Whitman wrote these autographs. I mean, that would be the big dream of saving that building, turning it into something that feeds the community.
Right. So there was talk about moving the building, and then there was talk about using just the bricks from it. There was sort of a committee, a foundation, the Heights Association, all these different groups, and they even got some federal agencies to agree with them. But in the end, this redevelopment authority just sort of went ahead with it in 1963, and that was the end of the story. And the plaque, the feature plaque that I mentioned, has gone missing, and is probably somewhere in Nicaragua.
Nicaragua, yes. Because it was a Nicaraguan deli in that building.
Yes, so that's another mystery for another time. But anyway, let's open it up to questions.
Yes. Regarding Pfaff's, there was the long table, which I imagine the journalists who lived in the area and the actors and actresses who practiced in the area would frequent. And then there was the big room. And was Walt, was he not more inclined to go to the big room and go around than to sit at like an Algonquin round table under the Edgar Allan Poe's, image?
He preferred the company of the workaday men that were sitting at the round tables rather than the big table up front. He was always, he took this observer stance always in his poetry, that he liked to watch more than he liked to actually participate. And I think anyway, his reputation, at least for a while, was kind of shaky with a lot of them, so they wouldn't maybe have welcomed him so readily to that big round table.
Yeah, because again, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but a lot of the bohemians at that table were quite a bit younger than him, and I think a bit more of a vicious bite to their critiques of poetry, and Whitman really was a bit of an outsider even from that younger group.
Yeah, so Henry Pfaff would convince this group, look, if we all rally behind Whitman, it's going to be good for the Bohemian brand. It's going to help us all. So they'd say, sure, I'll write a Whitman charity for your Saturday press. But then we have accounts that they would then read the poems around the table in such a way not to advertise for Whitman, but to take him down a couple things. So if you just read the newspapers, you get one story. When you look at some diaries and even family lore that was passed down through the generations from some of these writers, it was a much more contentious environment. You can see why Whitman gravitated toward that Fred Gray group, because some of these other young, ambitious writers, they saw a target on his back. They were shooting.
Back in those days, how would you define a bohemian? Was there a definition of it?
No, there definitely was. In fact, Fitzjames O'Brien, the one that writes the poem about the counterjumper and teases Whitman, he writes the first literary representation of bohemianism in the United States. The same year as Leaves of Grass, 1855. It's a short story called The Bohemian. And the character who describes himself as a bohemian says something like, I'm tolerably good looking, I'm good looking, I can write tolerably well, and I can woo women. And it's just kind of a joke. It's great that the first literary representation we have is already a parody, that this type was so well known that it could be a subject of ridicule. On the more serious side, it would be, this is someone who's itinerant, doesn't have a home. The term is a cultural appropriation of the Romani people, the gypsies of Europe, that you're kind of rootless, that you're not set in one place, but you're just kind of following your art, and that's where your home is, and that whatever sacrifices you have to make for that. So it's both kind of humorous, tongue-in-cheek, but then it also has a much more sincere connotation.
Karen, in your handout, there's 4 new photos.
Oh yeah, my beauty shot. If you have your handout in front of you, you can flip to column number 10. And what I did is I included, as I said, the photographs from the very earliest at 1, which is 1848 Walt Whitman in New Orleans, to the Good Great Poet at the end, the George Cox famous image. But I slipped in there something juicy for all of you at number 10, which are just 4 of several photographs probably taken by Thomas Eakins, the painter, who was a huge fan of Whitman's and actually painted a Whitman portrait, which hangs in the Philadelphia
Academy of Fine Arts.
The Academy, right. And apparently Eakins took many photographs of Whitman as studies for these portraits, and maybe for fun, because he did not do a full body shot of Whitman anyway, so, and he didn't do a nudie painting of him, but yeah, we have these, we have this, and you know what else we have? We have a recording of Whitman, or at least an alleged recording. Have you all heard it? Reading his very short poem, America. So apparently Thomas Edison had invented the phonograph, right? A sort of predecessor to the phonograph, basically a wax cylinder, and you crank it, and while somebody spoke into a tube, the bumps would appear on the wax cylinder and you'd get a recording of someone. And I don't know how you guys feel about it, but there's a recording that I think is Whitman reading this short poem. And we have a digitally remastered version of it in the exhibit, so you can press a button and listen to it. The reason to think it's Whitman is because in the archive in Menlo Park, where Edison is from, there are a couple of, I think, 2 notes about wanting to record Whitman. Edison was going around and recording the big names of his time. So there were really fun early Edison recordings of, I think, Tennyson and a couple of other really heavyweight poets. But also the accent on the recording is so unusual. It's called Tidewater Atlantic. And I don't know how you all say the word A-M-P-L-E. Right? He says ample, which might be a Dutch leftover, I don't know, but it's an accent that's gone. And the most fun reason I have is that the poem actually is 2 lines longer, but whoever is reciting this poem ends with the word love. And he says, and love, like some big hippie, you know. So I always think, that's gotta be my dad, that wants to sort of address America and have the last word be love. That would be so Walt. So, yeah, but that's a lot of, you know, as I was saying on the tour, there's so many photographs of Whitman. And very interestingly, these, and did you see the one with Pete Doyle? That's also a precious one too. If you flip in the handout to page, poem 6, where we talked about Gay Street, like such a telling glance between Walt and his lover, right? It's just so sweet, and they seem to be even sitting on one of those Victorian seats where you face each other so quaintly. I just love that image of the 2 of them.
It's my absolute favorite picture of the country. It's the joy.
Oh, you put it on the cover of Whitman in context.
Yeah, it's my favorite. I'm so happy.
So happy, yeah, so satisfying.
All right, any other questions?
Yeah, question. So he came here every day for how many years? And was he working at the Eagle then? And were they loose about their hours? Okay, so it was earlier. But he did come here every day.
He writes nearly every night, right? Yeah.
For like 3 years or something like that?
I dated 1858. That's an earlier year than you, maybe. But 1858, 59, 60, 61, and to the end of 62. So actually a legitimate 4 or 5 years that he's really frequenting this place. So he knew it. You know, like this was really...
And he had to get here from the ferry, which was, is that where the Brooklyn Bridge is now?
He probably took the Fulton Ferry, although there were different, there was like the Catherine Street Ferry, but his favorite was the Fulton, which if you're a Brooklynite, you know the Fulton Ferry landing there, where Brooklyn Ice Cream Factory used to be. I can't believe they were gone. I guess Ample Hills is moving in there. And then you can nowadays take the ferry over to Fulton Street in New York, right, where that...
Pure lemon, but yeah, in the past it would have been...
Right, a little bit further north than Wall Street. Like Fulton Street is where the South Street Seaport is, and you would walk up and you see St. Paul's when you hit Broadway.
And was this an evening activity or
Oh, yes.
all night
Oh, yes.
activity? I'm new because I don't know.
Well, in some of his notebooks, and I think you mentioned them, he's got these little black books where he lists men and their features. Like he'll say like, he said, or he uses the word gay, and occasionally he says slept with him. So I think sometimes it was just too much of a haul, or maybe not convenient to go all the way back to Brooklyn, and he spent evenings here.
Still is.
All right, you guys are taking over. Yeah.
Take him to get from Brooklyn here.
That's a really good question. If it's 6 mile round trip, I think it was a legitimate distance because he'd have to, like he was already living further out in Brooklyn by the 1850s, like Classen Avenue and then Portland Avenue. That's in the Fort Greene area, you know, like if you're no Brooklyn. So he'd have to take like a car to the ferry landing, which he had to wait for, and then take the ferry, and then come up from the ferry and take probably a car up there because that's not too close.
But Whitman, of course, yeah, there's no Uber, certainly. But Whitman, of course, was this sort of hardcore flaneur. He loved to
He
get
loved
out
to
and
walk,
walk
right.
and roam for long, long distances. It was never boring for him from anything I can ever tell. He was just sucking in every detail, every interaction with somebody was giving him something. So.
Ms. Kieran's written an essay, a pair of essays about this, that part of it was work, right? He's working for the Brooklyn Daily Times, he's got to come cover the culture beat in Manhattan. So he's over here for work, he stays later.
For work.
Do you know of references to Whitman and the Bowery?
Whitman writes a series of essays about the Bowery.
In the Bowery Theater, because you know there was that culture war between Charles McGrady, who was like the teacup school of acting, who was doing Macbeth at the same time as Edmund Forrest. And I think Forrest was sort of this broad Arnold Schwarzenegger style acting. And there was the riots, right, in 1849. So Walt does write about that. The Bowery was very present for him.
There are no other questions. The last thing I'll mention is if anyone has any particular connections or interests in working with us to put a plaque out in the sidewalk or to get the building specifically landmarked for its history related to Pfaff's, talk to any one of us.
You know who to go to.
Yes.
My email address is on this thing. And I guess we're generally accessible anyway, so yeah, we would love some help with that. We've had a hard time with that.
On that, what sort of help do you need?
That's a nice answer, thank you.
Yes. I think one thing that would help in going to the owner is if we had some sort of financial backing, of course, saying we will pay for the plaque to go in and the installation. So that, of course, would be one thing that would make things easier and grease the skids. So
But if we wanted to put it, we've been talking about putting it into the city sidewalk.
Right.
So this would be more sort of city connections, but
City connections
actually
is
trying to maneuver.
Ever done that? Are there plaques?
I think so.
On 41st Street Library Way,
That's
has a
right.
series.
Also downtown there are
Right.
grass things.
To commemorate all the ticker tape parades, right?
It would even be more fitting in many ways to have it in the sidewalk since Pfaff's was right down there. So a city.
Do you think his resistance is that he's afraid if you put that there, he can't, that the building will become preserved and then he can't sell it, so it can't get knocked down and become a hotel or something like that?
Yeah, or sell it to NYU. I'm sure. But thank you for asking.
That's a very preliminary start. The avenue that we had looked at and that we had pursued really seriously maybe 9 months ago was attempting to get a plaque placed on the building facade in the same manner that SHP has placed plaques for James Baldwin, etc. elsewhere in the U.S.
But we had no luck with that. You know, the owner is very non-responsive to that. So that's why we started thinking about the city instead. But we could use another brain. I mean, just machinating about ways in which, people pass this every day, right? My NYU students walk right by and have no idea that right underneath it's actually even cool history. The first bohemian bar in America. And there's no recognition, right? When we just went into their Hans, you can see there's even tin ceiling, there's features that are left over, and yet, this is part of the frustration we're encountering.
Well, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
the presentation.
Thank you.